Today I'm going to be talking about my priority for the 60th session. As with all my predecessors, I do have a theme, and when I was elected, I informed member states that my theme for the 60th session would be the Post-2015 Development Agenda, setting the stage. Now you may ask, why that particular theme? Why choose that to begin with? Why not something else? And as I look around the room, I see colleagues from a previous life. And let me just confess, they know more about the subject than I do. So I don't expect any question from the Brazilian ambassador to Japan. So please, I have warned him. He's a bit of a show-off, and he would want to test my knowledge. So I concede, I'm conceding up front. He knows more about this than I do. Thank you very much. Why this topic? There is a reason. Back in 2000, heads of state and government got together in New York, and they agreed to a set of goals known as the Millennium Development Goals. And here they are, a quick summary of what they are. Now, these goals are important because they set the stage for the development agenda for the next 15 years. And that's what the D in that acronym MDG stands for. With these goals came a set of targets. And these goals had the attraction of being short, everyone could understand them, and they look realizable. In fact, in many instances, they were. But like all goals, they were intended to achieve an objective by the year 2015. And in an ideal world, they probably would. But you will remember, in 2008 and 2009, we had a set of crises, economic and financial, which caused a number of setbacks. And it could be argued that we still haven't quite recovered from those crises. So this led to a sort of uneven progress in the implementation of the goals. Some were achieved and some weren't. And if you look at where we are today, you would see that the clock is ticking. We are fast approaching December 31st, 2015. We have less than 700 days to go, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Quite frankly, we will not achieve all the goals. But that is not to say that a good faith effort was not made, and we could still come very, very close to achieving all the goals if we make that last extra effort. And here's where a country like Japan has a very important role to play. I just found out recently that Japan was once one of, if not the top donor when it comes to assistance for development. It has since fallen behind. But with so much to do, and given the importance of these goals, I, today, am putting out a challenge to the government of Japan, represented here at various levels, to step up to the plate, to come back to the fold, and increase its development assistance so that we can make that last sprint to achieving the development goals, the MDGs. There are a number of success stories, and you will see here we have halved the number of people living in poverty. Over 2 billion people gain access to improved sources of drinking water. Here, the incidence of HIV and malaria, etc., have fallen. So there have been some success in achieving the MDGs. But, as I said before, because of a number of factors, the crisis being among those, we still have a lot of work to do. As you can see, the sanitation goal is perhaps the single most goal that's still lagging. We still have work to do on health and child survival rates, inequalities, and this is important going forward. Inequalities still pervasive. And the reason why I say that, one of the goals in which we have met success is the whole thrust to halving the rate of poverty. And as we go forward, the question of poverty and the eradication of poverty will be central to whatever we do. Here's some things you may want to think about. You will see that we still have quite a number of people living in poverty. You will see that almost 1 billion people live without clean water. Over 1 billion people have no access to electricity. And again, here we are with sanitation and what 1 billion people do when it comes to open defecation. Now, what have we done? Just last September, again, heads of state, some of the same from 2000, again came to New York, and yes, they did shop, yes, they went to good restaurants, yes, they ate, but they also did some work. And they decided that they will renew their commitment to the MDGs. They will make one last effort to try and achieve them by the deadline of December 31st, 2015. You will see that they will focus on those goals that have not yet been achieved. But here, and this is where I come in, they took a decision that they were going to develop a post-2015 development agenda. And not only that, they laid down some markers of what that agenda ought to contain. You will see that it has to be inclusive and people-centered. It has to reinforce a commitment to poverty, sustainable development, which is one of the aspects many people believe was missing from the original MDGs. There's no sustainable development goal per se. However, the overall thrust is towards the achievement of sustainable development. And they were going to take up some new challenges which have emerged since that seminal decision was taken back in 2000. Where does this all started to come together? Even before last September, there was a conference that was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It was held exactly on the 20th anniversary of the so-called Earth Summit, which took place back in 1992. And there were a number of things that came out of that conference, which in many ways will define the shape of the post-2015 development agenda. For one thing, if they didn't realize it before, governments came away from that Rio conference with the sobering realization that it is not possible to achieve sustainable development by acting alone. Other stakeholders will need to come on board, more specifically, civil society and all aspects of it, including the private sector. I mean, there were many things coming out of the Rio conference, but I think that is one of the central tenets, is that the realization that governments cannot do it by themselves, and you need all actors, all stakeholders on board, including the private sector. So, as we go forward to this post-2015 development agenda, we're going to need to look at this central theme, eradicating poverty, and not just poverty, but extreme poverty. That is going to be important going forward. As I said before, we have to look at the unfinished business. We simply cannot just junk the MDGs and start from scratch. That would be foolhardy. A lot of time, effort, and money went into their implementation. As I said, there have been some notable successes. True, there are still many goals that have not yet been realized, but that doesn't mean you simply throw out the proverbial baby and bath water and start from scratch. Otherwise, you'll probably end up with the same set of goals plus some add-ons as well. But what's going to be important is that it can't be the usual way in which we do business. We need a single overarching framework. It is not unusual for the UN to pursue what we have come to know as a silo approach. That is, different issues are dealt with separately, even though there may be interlinkages between them. So we need a sort of overarching framework as we go forward. Here, we need to get all actors on board. So it can't be a top-down approach. I'm sure some of you would be surprised to learn that the MDGs were devised by a group of people sitting in a conference room in UN headquarters in New York and then handed out to the rest of the world. Now, you would argue that that has its attractions, but clearly, if you need buy-in from the wider public, they would need to be involved in the process from the very start. So, as we go forward with this 2015 development agenda, we need more of a bottom-up approach. We need an approach where we listen to people to hear what they actually want as we go forward with a development agenda that is intended to be universal. And of course, we must include all stakeholders, not just governments. It can't be governments alone. So as I said, back in June 2012, coming out of Rio, we started the process. We started the ball rolling, and there were a number of activities. For one, we called for a group to look at the whole question of financing for sustainable development over the long term. There is a group looking at a set of sustainable development goals, because everyone realized that from the MDGs, the sustainable development component was missing. And so there was a need to look at the sustainable aspect of our work going forward. We know that solutions will be many, they'll be varied, but technology will play a large role. And so the whole question of technology transfer from those who have to those who don't will be central to our discussions. So we're looking into how we can devise a technology transfer mechanism. So that's what the heads agreed to, among other things, at this RIA conference back in June 2012. Where are we today? One of the things that they called for is this open working group that is looking at these goals that are primarily in the sustainable development arena. That group, in theory, is supposed to have 30 members. In practice, it's much larger because everyone wanted to be there. And I suppose the problem that they were trying to avoid is a sort of top-down approach where very few people get to decide on a matter of such significance. So you have in something around 70 to 90 people looking at this. And of course, it's open to other member states and experts. And you can see it was an exercise that involves the UN system. It had hundreds, literally hundreds of statements, a number of side events. Eventually, they came up with 19 focal areas. These focal areas covered a number of issues which you would not find readily in the existing MDGs. And they talk about settlements, security, cities, oceans, women, youth, water, employment, food, etc. And here is a summary of the 19 focal areas that this open working group has identified. During this very week, that group is meeting to refine these focal areas. And that's an exercise that will continue up until the group issues its report in September of this year. It is supposed to submit a report to the next session of the General Assembly, which is the 69th session that begins in September. As I said, we are also looking into the financing aspect, or the more broader question of the means of implementation. If you want goals to fail, it's to have goals without the means to implement them. And so to avoid that, we're looking into the whole question of financing, how we finance the post-2015 development agenda. And here again is where a country like Japan has a very important role to play. And then, separate from that larger question, there is a group, a small group, and this is truly a small one, of experts looking into the whole question of financing. And then there will be a larger effort that would look at the Monterey Consensus, which is one of the outcomes that came out back in 2002, I believe. This conference, it is expected to be held sometime next year, and it would feed into the post-2015 development process. Now, where do I come in? As I said, as President of the General Assembly, I have asked member states to start looking at this post-2015 development agenda. We simply can't wait until December 31st, 2015 to come up out of thin air with an agenda. So, with that in mind, I've identified 6 events to get member states to focus on a variety of areas, which I think are going to be central to the post-2015 development agenda. There are a number of events. They come in 2 categories. There are high-level events, and then there are thematic debates. First, the high-level events. There are 3, as you will see. 1, focusing on women, the young, and civil society, and that was held in March. We're going to be looking at South-South, and this is an area, a North-South triangle cooperation, where Japan is heavily involved. We're also going to be looking at human rights and the rule of law in June. So this will take place in May, and this will take place in June. As you know, when you talk about development, the whole question of the person, human security, human rights, the rule of law, do come in. So that's why we're going to be focusing on human rights and the rule of law. Then there will be 3 thematic debates. We have had one on water, sanitation, and sustainable energy. So the environmental aspects of the sustainable development question. That was held in February. In a couple of days, we will have one on the role of partnerships, because as I said before, there is now a strong realization, indeed a consensus, that governments can't do it by themselves, and we would need partners going forward if we are to achieve sustainable development in the long run. And finally, here we'll be talking about peaceful and stable societies. The question you'd ask is, what's that? Some countries, unfortunately, have been involved in conflict. Some are emerging from what we call post-conflict situations. So we need to look at how we can ensure stable and peaceful societies going forward, because these countries are still part of the international community. Based on the events that we have had so far, here's what we have found, and these are actually preliminary. We would have a much broader picture after we have completed all events in June. There is consensus that there should be goals on water and energy. Means of implementation is going to be very, very important going forward. Funding, the funding question looms very, very large. And it's not just official development assistance or ODA. The private sector will have a role to play. Again, partnerships involving all stakeholders are going to be important, and the need for strong institutions and how we monitor implementation going forward. The question of gender and its current inequality was also central to our discussions. And so there is a strong call for a goal on gender. Youth are going to be central to whatever we do. And so one would expect the question of youth to be dealt with, and more importantly, there are some calling for a so-called youth goal. Civil society needs to be brought on board, and we need to ensure that they are not just invited to the table to sit there and be quiet, but to participate in the decision-making going forward. After we complete all these events, and bearing in mind these other bodies that were mandated by the RIA Plus 20 conference are working in their separate areas, ISPG will convene a stock-taking event next September, where we will try to pull all this together just before the start of the next session. Now, where do you come in? As I said, this just can't be about me or just governments or just the UN General Assembly. You too have a role to play. Given what UNU is all about, I hope that you can participate in discussions through major groups. You do research. We need to start looking at how we can interlink the three dimensions of sustainable development, namely the economic. So in other words, we're looking at this interface, because this is going to be important going forward. These are dealt with separately. In fact, they're separate departments of the UN that deal with these things. Here you have environment, which is the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, and the economic and social are dealt with by a department known as DESA, which is based, Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York. But these issues are treated separately. So we need to start looking at this interface, because only then we will be on the road to sustainable development, when we link these so-called three pillars of sustainable development. Now, you'll also be called upon to implement whatever agenda is agreed upon in September 2015. And through these knowledge-based societies, having sustainable development in various education curricula, and how you can drive innovation and developing technical and scientific solutions to address the new challenges which have emerged since 2000. And there is an MDG that calls for a global partnership, MDG 8, I believe, which happens to be one of the least implemented goals as well. So we need to have organizations such as UNU participating in a global partnership that will develop open access to knowledge and also encourage more multi-stakeholder partnerships for development. Where does this all end? As you can see here, there's a timeline which is supposed to culminate in September 2015 here, when we adopt the Post-2015 development agenda at a summit. At at the heads of state and government level in New York. So these bodies will submit their reports in September. We have requested the Secretary General of the United Nations to prepare what is called a synthesis report. But it will not just be based on what governments do. He has to look at the full range of inputs, including from other stakeholders. And that report, and this is going to be key, that report, which is expected sometime around October of this year, will form the basis for the negotiations on the post-2015 development agenda. So, my request to you is if you have something to contribute, make sure it gets into the system. UNU is part of that system, because this report is going to be crucial to the process, the negotiating process that will begin later this year. As I said, there will be a conference on financing for development sometime in the early part of next year, and that too will contribute to the negotiating process, the means of implementation aspect, and finally, we have the adoption of the post-2015 development agenda. Thank you very much.